Um, that's a great question. That's the first step. This is all theory until you start implementing. And the first thing that one needs to realize is that technology strategy is hardly ever about technology alone. It's really about the mission, about long-term vision, about really having a holistic view of your organization and how it functions and what it takes for your organization to be successful. And the first step starts with the mission. You must understand the mission. You must know what your organizational outcomes are. What does success mean for your organization? That is something that usually with a strong leadership is conveyed throughout your organizational culture, so that's the first step. You have to familiarize yourself with the mission. Once you do that, then you want to step back and say, okay, how can I use technology to further one of my outcomes, as I said earlier. And here, many people make the mistake that they go, this is still high-level thinking. You rarely talk about the actual tools to do that. So you don't talk about a MailChimp or a Google Doc yet. Here you're just talking about what are the realities of current technology that is accessible to us based on our funding, based on our tech savviness across the organization. What are some of the technologies that exist, right, that could help us fulfill our mission better? So for instance, we say one of our organizational outcomes is to increase our grant revenue by X percent of our total budget. So then one strategy that you could implement is to say, okay, I'm going to try to leverage the power of the internet to gather as much data as possible to automate maybe grant reports, which are tremendously time consuming if you have received grants. So here you'll have these various compartments, automating grant reports, scraping the internet for all donor database, all grant databases out there, maybe even scraping the internet for all blogs on how to apply for certain kinds of grants. So now we notice we didn't really talk about the actual technologies involved, but much more we really talking about the high level of what needs to be accomplished. So if I am successful implementing my technology strategy, then I'll be successful at boosting one of my outcomes, then I'll be more successful at performing at my mission, which is what all nonprofits exist to do. So once you do that, once you have your plan, kind of your broader strategy involved, now you want to, some people would say you have to do a work plan. I like to call it execution. I think in the nonprofit sector, it's been common nowadays that we are committed to strategy. To some extent, you have people doing 5-year and 3-year strategic plans. I'm not a big fan of those. Take an example, if you were to do a 5-year workout plan. How realistic is it that you're going to be sticking to your workout plan 5 years from now? Things change. There's a lot of turnover in the nonprofit sector. I prefer personally, and I recommend others, to follow a 1-year plan. And although it seems year to year is better than day to day. So I think if you feel that your organization is stable enough, you're welcome to do a 3-year strategy, but everybody has strategy. So of course you'll gain an advantage over organizations that don't have a strategy, the ant versus the grasshopper analogy, right? Some people don't think long term, and you'll definitely have an advantage over those people. However, then the vast majority of organizations that have strategy, you will have to gain an advantage in execution. Some people don't execute their plan, or they execute them poorly. So this is where you really look to gain the upper hand on against other organizations. And I don't make it seem like it's such a cutthroat competition, but it's just the idea that execution is crucial. So the next step after you have implemented this, you have outlined your strategic plan or your technology strategy, you want to go ahead and actually execute it. And in this case, you really have to, what we like to do in Muslim Buddy is really to have these smaller compartmentalized implementations, because especially if it's dramatic changes from what your staff does, you don't want to have a rebellion. You want to make sure that everything is phased out slowly so that you get a small group of people who become your champions. You implement it with them, and you have to think now about your employees as your customers. When you're a software developer or in any type of service, even if you sell shoes, the customer is king. So to make sure that you have a small dedicated group of first-time users in your organization, and you try to sell them that idea, and you're with them all the time for months, just giving them any help they need, basically. You suspend everything else to make sure that that small group of quote-unquote testers adopt the technology, and then they become champions of that technology for everybody else. So then they could go and help the person next to them in their cubicle in terms of acquiring this new technology. But then unfortunately, it's not done. Your work still has to keep going. Next, after implementing your strategy, which could take 3, 6 months, a year, you have to start measuring outcomes. How well are you impacting your outcomes? And there's a variety of ways of doing that, but measurement is just a natural thing that has to be done. And when I first joined the nonprofit sector, I was surprised that people were given pats on the back when they measure. And, I went to a session at MCN that said it takes a real leader to measure performance. In the for-profit sector, that goes without saying. Amazon does not get credit for measuring or analyzing, buyer trends and et cetera, and customer trends. So I think that it is time for us also not to get kudos for doing what is necessary for us to excel. After measuring your performance towards your desired outcomes, or maybe one outcome that you identified from your strategic plan that you were going to use technology to impact, you go back and you redesign again. So now it's just a continuous loop, and that's what a CTO does. That's his or her day job. You work with the CEO and the CFO to understand the mission. You implement a technology strategy that helps you fulfill that mission in a certain way. You go and you execute that strategy with concrete technologies that you would use. You roll out that technology to a small group of members in your organization so that it's not too much of a culture shock. Once they adopt it, you expect them to help spreading the technology across your entire organization. You measure your performance towards your outcomes now using this technology. And finally, you start again. You go back and you try to see if there are other ways now that you could improve your organization's performance using technology.